This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Beijing slaps a U.S. export ban on raw materials critical for battery making and semiconductors in retaliation for the latest crackdown by Washington on China's chip industry. Now, Australia wants the big powers to play nice. Foreign Minister Penny Wong said on a visit to Singapore that the world expects the US and China to manage their competition responsibly. Or we speak to the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles. And Nepal's Prime Minister breaks tradition, choosing China over India for his first official visit, eyeing key investment deals. Meanwhile, Germany's foreign minister wraps up a tense Beijing trip, with China's Wang Yi urging cooperation despite deep differences. And Taiwan's president touches down in the Marshall Islands, marking his first official visit since taking office in May, part of a Pacific tour to strengthen ties with diplomatic allies. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, a 7-year expansion project at South Korea's Incheon International Airport wraps up, turning it into the world's third largest in-passenger handling capacity. What cutting-edge features are taking flight? Plus, Vietnam in talks with China and Japan as it sets its sights on a multi-billion-dollar bullet train to connect Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City in just 5 hours. It's the communist country's biggest ever infrastructure project. We ask an expert, can Hanoi deliver? We begin with escalating trade tensions between the world's two biggest economies. Beijing says it will ban exports of some key components in making semiconductors to the US, a day after another crackdown by Washington on China's chip sector. Well, CNA's Roland Lim is standing by with the latest on that. So, Roland, tell us more about what's been announced.
Well, Sally, China is restricting exports of items related to gallium, germanium, among other rare earth minerals critical for semiconductors and ammunition. The curbs strengthen enforcement of existing limits on exports of these minerals that Beijing began rolling out last year, marking the latest escalation of trade tensions. Meanwhile, Chinese chip companies targeted by Washington are gearing up to deal with the new sanctions. Now, they have vowed to speed up supply chain localization and said that they would be able to continue production thanks to recent efforts to build up on their stockpiles. But the investor confidence has been on shaky ground. The CSI chip index wavered, sliding more than 1% on concerns of an escalation in US-China chip war. Semiconductor manufacturers listed on the mainland markets led the declines. Shares of China's top chip foundry, SMIC, well, that fell 2.5% today. Naura Technology is among those that contributed the most to the decline, slumping nearly 4%. A smaller domestic rival, Will Semiconductor, also seeing a sell-off as well. But the firms are now saying that the latest curbs would have limited impact on their operations and that they would use this situation to accelerate their localization process. Now, while some others are looking to stock up and to make domestic substitutions. At the same time, major Asian chip stocks outside of China rising today, shrugging off the new US sanctions. The world's largest contract chip supplier, TSMC, saw shares rise 2.4%. And Japanese chip-related stocks also rising. Tokyo Electron leading the trading day up nearly 5%, while Advantest, its rival, gained about 4%. SoftBank, which owns a stake in British chip designer ARM, saw its shares rise 3.6%. The latest chip curbs will also target sales of high-bandwidth memory chips, which could affect the world's two largest memory chip makers. That's in South Korea, SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics. SK Hynix shares adding about 4% at the closing bell, while Samsung closed unchanged from yesterday. For more analysis, we're now joined by Yong Wook Ryu. He is Assistant Professor of International Politics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Professor Ryu, good to have you with us. Let's start with some background information first. Now, China has been proactive in this chip war with the US to become more self-sufficient. What's your assessment of China's reaction policy-wise to the last two crackdowns?
For the past two crackdowns, the Chinese government has adopted threefold response. The first is to invest heavily in the domestic chip industry, covering the entire production lines, from software's manufacturing to packaging and equipments. And the second response has been to attract foreign talent and engineers, mainly from Taiwan, but also from other countries like South Korea. And then the last bit of response has been to attempt to drive a wedge between the United States and her allies and partners by trying to convince the latter countries that participating in the U.S.-led chip pressure against China would not serve their economic interest. For the latest sanctions, which expands a already long list of export controls on chips to China, I think the Chinese response will be much of the same.
So these sanctions, Professor, they're unlikely to moderate China's chip ambitions. Well, according to some market watchers, China is already far ahead technologically than previously believed. So is there a case to be made that trying to contain this dual-use technologies is ineffective?
Yes, I think here we need to, it could be useful to divide advanced chips from more legacy and low and medium-end chips. For legacy and low and medium-end chips, the Chinese government's massive subsidies have increased the price competitiveness of Chinese chips. And coupled with ever-increasing quality of Chinese firms, the price competitive Chinese legacy and low and medium-end chips have increasingly taken a greater market share. So some success here for the Chinese government. However, for advanced chips, I think we have to be a bit more cautious in assessing China's capabilities, because information is not transparent or forthcoming and kept pretty tightly. But my view is that the Chinese abilities have grown to be able to produce 7 nanometer, maybe even 5 nanometer advanced chips, which puts China just about 3 to 5 years behind Taiwan. However, the key here is not just the fact that China can produce them, but how efficiently the Chinese firms can produce them, which is often called the yield rate. And on this point, I think China's yield rate still trails quite far behind that of Taiwan and South Korea, many thanks to the recent US export controls on China.
Professor Ryu, meantime, though, Chinese chipmakers are putting up a brave face, saying that the new sanctions would be manageable. For example, Shanghai-listed Skyver says it's not seeing a significant impact to its production because it produces locally, sells to the domestic market. But what about companies that have to source outside of China?
Yes, and once again here, I think for the legacy and low and medium-end chips, Chinese firms should be fine and can withstand American pressure. But if Chinese government wants to compete with the United States in higher-end chips and the latest technologies such as AI and applications with military use, then they must get hold of more advanced chips. And here, the U.S. export controls on advanced chips, the HBM memory chips, right, advanced equipment, and so on and so forth, creates a fairly restrictive environment for the Chinese firms to succeed. Now, the Chinese government is investing massively to inculcate domestic capabilities to establish the entire supply chains in China. If things go very well, according to the Chinese plans, then maybe the game is going to be on. But so far, I think evidence suggests that the Chinese firms are struggling quite a bit. But I think the jury is still out.
Well, from what we can see, Professor, China has already fired its first retaliatory salvo with these export restrictions on critical minerals to the U.S. I'm curious to know, how else do you think China can retaliate against the new U.S. chip curbs?
You know, in the past, the Chinese government could not really take retaliatory actions because China is in no position to take retaliatory measures in the chip industry against the United States, as the global supply chains of chip production are heavily dominated and controlled by the United States and her allies and partners. Now, this time, I think the Chinese government wants to send out a very strong signal and message to incoming Trump administration that China is not going to just be quiet on the receiving end, and it will take some specific retaliatory measures. As your report covered, it's going to be about weaponizing critical minerals, right? That Chinese have some edge over the Americans. I think the best kind of retaliation the Chinese government can take is to successfully develop domestic chip industry and establish the entire supply chains domestically with the capabilities that can match those of the United States and her allies and partners. And this is where the real game is on. The US is going to make it difficult for China to achieve this. The Chinese government is going to put in money in the industry to make it possible.
Professor Ryu, thank you very much for that analysis. That was Young-Wook Ryu, Assistant Professor of International Politics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I will be back a little later on with more business news. Otelli, it's back to you.
Oh, thank you so very much, Roland. In other news, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong says that the importance of her country's relationship with China can be seen in Canberra's consistent efforts in restoring dialogue and engagement with Beijing. She also stressed that ties between great powers such as China and the US are of huge consequence to Australia and also the world. Now, her comments coming ahead of a meeting between Singaporean and Australian officials in Singapore.
The way we manage our interests in the face of challenges involving great powers is only partly through our direct dealing. Much of the answer lies in approaching these challenges in regional terms. There is a lot that happens in the thousands of kilometres between Australia, the United States and China, just as there is a lot that happens in the broader Indo-Pacific.
Ms. Wong also cautioned on the tensions in the South China Sea and stressed the importance of peace and stability.
And when disputes arise, and they inevitably will, we want to insist that those differences are managed through dialogue, not simply by force or the exercise of raw power, which is why we welcome the resumption of dialogue between the United States and China. And we will continue to publicly and privately articulate our hope, our expectation that I'm sure is shared, that both these great powers manage competition responsibly.
Just a short while ago, I spoke with Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles, who is also in Singapore for the ministerial meetings. And he said that he is sure that AUKUS, a trilateral security deal with the US and the UK, will be sustained even with President-elect Donald Trump's return to the White House in January.
We're pretty confident about AUKUS and how AUKUS will operate in the context of the Trump administration, and that's based on what those in the Trump administration have said, such as the National Security Advisor designate Waltz, who's been a supporter of AUKUS, as others have been, but also based on what people have done.
Well, do stay on for the full interview with Australian Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles later this hour on East Asia Tonight. Nepalese Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli is in China's capital city, Beijing, for a 4-day official visit at the invitation of Chinese Premier Li Qiang. And in the coming days, Mr. Oli will meet Chinese President Xi Jinping and Chairman of the National People's Congress of China, Zhao Lezi, for talks. Now, on the table for the Himalayan Republic are existing investment deals, as well as expanding cooperation on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Mr. Oli's trip to Beijing appears to break a long-standing tradition, as Nepalese leaders typically begin their maiden trips with a visit to India, the country's biggest trade partner with centuries-old ties. And for more, we are joined now by CNA's Tan Sihui in Beijing. Sihui, can you tell us more about the Nepalese Prime Minister's agenda?
Now, Mr. Oli is here in China on a 4-day visit. It is his third time as Prime Minister here in China. He has met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and he's expected to hold talks with Chinese Premier Li Qiang. Now, what's the agenda? Well, the main thing on the table right now is to talk about cooperation on the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is China's ambitious infrastructure project. And so far, what we know is that both sides have signed the BRI in 2017, but so far there has been no plans. And so what they're hoping to do is to prioritize reviving this project and then also to be discussing new plans. And Nepali media, they have reported that road projects such as the Koshi corridor that's supposedly going to link Nepal and Tibet may be on the table.
Also, Suhui, what do you think his visit to China first instead of India likely mean?
Yeah, that was a big question. I mean, that really stood out. Typically, Nepal's leaders would pick India as their first choice of destination, but this time around, Mr. Oli picked China. What we understand is that Mr. Oli, who heads a coalition government, he's seeking to have balanced ties between China and India, the two super major powers, because historically, Nepal has had heavy dependence on India, and so he's seeking to reduce that dependence. Now, Nepali media also reported that Nepal has not received a formal invitation from India, and so that's why they are here in China instead. Now, Nepal is sandwiched between these two super major powers, India and China, geographically as well as economically. Now, India accounts for 2/3 of Nepal's international trade, China accounting for about 15%. India is also the highest foreign investment partner into Nepal at around $750 million for the fiscal year in 2023 to 2024, and for China, $250 million.
Well, thanks for all those figures and numbers and stats. CNA Tan Sihui live from Beijing. Right, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Donald Trump vows to block Nippon Steel's bid for U.S. steel. And later, Japan's 7-Eleven plans to expand in Australia's $4 billion convenience store market. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia Tonight. We've got more business news for you now with Roland Lim. And Roland, a 4-year trade row between China and Australia appear to be finally ending?
That's right. China has announced the dismantling of one of the final barriers in a trade war that's hammered $13 billion worth of exports. Now, China has lifted all bans on Australian beef, bringing an end to an avalanche of tariffs by Beijing on a range of products since bilateral ties hit a low back in 2020. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour government has welcomed the move, saying that it would boost the country's red meat exports, which are forecast to break records in the 2024 and 2025 fiscal year. Now, China is the second biggest market for Australian beef and veal after the US. Since 2020, Beijing placed bans on more than $13 billion worth of Australian products, including wine and barley. And this includes Chinese sanctions on 10 beef processing plants in Australia. Now, these bans were removed in stages since December last year, and export approvals were finally restored to the remaining 2 abattoirs. Despite the bans, the value of beef exports to China grew, rising 16% on year to $2.5 billion Australian dollars in 2023. Now, 7&I Holdings is planning to run 1,000 convenience stores in Australia by the end of the decade. This as the 7-Eleven parent seeks to grow its market share in the country using the product and location know-how that helped the company build up its Japanese business. 7-Eleven currently boasts some 780 stores in Australia. The group is expecting to open more stores in urban areas using data collection on pedestrian and vehicle traffic. Now, there are also plans to bring in food manufacturing equipment and recipes from Japan. 7&I is seeking to roll out more hot food items such as pizza and fried dim sum at their Australian stores. The convenience chain has more than 30% market share in the country, despite fierce competition in the food market amid rising cost of living. The goal is to reach 45% or more by 2030. A chairperson of the 7-Eleven International, that's Shinji Abe, aims to bring average daily sales per store to $12,000 in the future from the current $4,500. An annual business sentiment survey of British firms operating in China paints a bleak picture for the world's second biggest economy. Now, they feel doing business there has become harder over the past year due to sluggish conditions, and they expect that situation to remain in 2025. Now, that is despite China rolling out a series of stimulus measures over the past months to bolster the $19 trillion economy. The findings by the lobby group are based on 400 members' views over September and November. It revealed that 58% of companies felt that doing business in China had become more difficult over the past year, with 86% of such firms blaming economic factors. Only 41% of its members expect to have a better time next year. AstraZeneca, BP, Jaguar Land Rover, Standard Chartered Bank, and Rolls-Royce are among the members of the chamber. China's economy has struggled to mount a durable recovery following the abandonment of Beijing's strict COVID curbs in late 2022, and that's led analysts to warn that a period of stagnation could be on the cards, as seen in Japan in the 90s. China's central bank governor has reaffirmed plans for supportive monetary policy to promote growth next year. Now, that's as the economy faces fresh challenges from a looming trade war with the U.S., following President-elect Donald Trump's renewed tariff threats. Bank Governor Pan Gongsheng reiterated the central bank's plans for measures to boost growth at a financial forum in Beijing. The governor added that the People's Bank of China will also use various tools to keep liquidity ample and lower borrowing costs for companies and residents. Now, experts say monetary policy support will be critical to China's economy next year, as the U.S. president-elect has vowed to impose steep tariffs on Chinese goods. And that threatens the outlook for exports, which has been a key growth driver for China since the pandemic. Those concerns pushed China's renminbi past a key threshold to the lowest level in more than a year against the dollar. It breached the psychologically important 7.3 per dollar level. Its onshore counterpart also trading just pips away from that key point, despite a persistently firmer than expected official guidance. The yuan was hit hard by Trump's tariffs on Chinese imports during his first term. Now, it weakened about 5% against the dollar during the initial round of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods back in 2018 and fell another 1.5% a year later when trade tensions escalated. Experts say the Chinese currency is an even more precarious position this time around due to a weak economy, deflationary pressure, as well as outflow of foreign capital from mainland markets. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has renewed his pledge to block planned takeover of U.S. steel by Japanese company Nippon Steel that's worth nearly $15 billion. Mr. Trump posted on his Truth Social platform saying that he would instead use tariff and tax incentives to revive the American steelmaker. In response, Nippon Steel said it is determined to protect and grow U.S. steel and vowed to invest at least $2.7 billion into the company. The Japanese steelmaker is hoping to complete its planned acquisition by the end of the year before Trump takes office in January. Embattled U.S. Steel has argued that it needs the Nippon deal to keep its Pennsylvania headquarters and plants open and to stay competitive against foreign manufacturers. Several stakeholders and workers of U.S. Steel have backed the takeover, but the proposed merger has been opposed by Steel Workers Union, and that's headquarters in Pennsylvania, a key battleground state in the presidential election. Both Mr. Trump and President Joe Biden had jockeyed for support of union workers in their respective campaigns. And the deadline for the review of the deal set to be done by the end of this month. Nippon Steel stayed above water most of the day but ended flat as its takeover of U.S. Steel hangs in the balance, while U.S. Steel is slumping by 7% in pre-market trade in New York. And that is the latest in business intelligence.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, it's time now for another break. But coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Vietnam approves the construction of a high-speed railway to link its capital Hanoi in the north with Ho Chi Minh City in the south. Is China, which is known for its railway diplomacy, expected to edge out the competition in the bidding process? Well, we'll speak with an expert later. You're watching East Asia Tonight. Beijing slaps a U.S. export ban on raw materials critical for battery making and semiconductors in retaliation for the latest crackdown by Washington on China's chip industry. Nepal's Prime Minister breaks tradition, choosing China over India for his first official visit, eyeing key investment deals. And Taiwan's president is in the Marshall Islands, part of a Pacific tour to strengthen ties with diplomatic allies. Vietnam wants to build a high-speed railway that can run from the capital Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City in just 5 hours. It's banking on domestic funding for the $67 billion project. But reports say Vietnam is also in talks with China and Japan. Lawmakers gave the green light for the mega project over the weekend. The high-speed train will have a top speed of 350 kilometers per hour, cutting what's now a 35-hour trip on the country's slow trains to just 5.5 hours. The 1,500-kilometer line will run the length of the country. Starting in Hanoi, it will cross 20 provinces and cities, including Da Nang and Nha Trang, and end in Ho Chi Minh City. Construction could start in 2027 and targeted completion in 8 years, although Vietnam has a record of major infrastructure delays. The project will require moving 120,000 residents and removing parts of protected forests and rice fields. Vietnam is also planning 2 other high-speed rail links with China by 2030. Hanoi has said it wants to learn from Beijing and has sent officials to work with Chinese rail companies. China is Vietnam's largest trading partner and a key source of imports for the ASEAN countries' manufacturing sector. Now, for more, we have Nguyen Kak Zang, a visiting fellow from the Vietnam Studies Program at IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, joining us live. Well, a warm welcome, Dr. Zang. Firstly, let's just talk about Vietnam's ambition to complete this express rail project in just 8 years. And we talked about how, this country is always sort of delaying and there are all these overruns on big infrastructure projects. So, Dr. Zang, do you think that it will actually meet that deadline?
Well, I think it's important to note that because of all those delays, it's very important to set a deadline. Although realistically, I think we would not expect to have this high-speed railway from connecting the north to the south, let's say in 10 years. But nevertheless, it's important to have a deadline so that Vietnam, the bureaucracy, can really push forward the plans and also amassing enough financial resources to construct this very important project. And in Vietnam, it's called the project of the century. So I think it would be very important to have such a deadline.
Right. So it's realistically not going to be operational, at least not within 10 years, from what I understand you're saying, Dr. Zhang. But this $67 billion price tag, though, I mean, it is quite significant. And I'm curious to know what are your thoughts on how Vietnam plans to finance this project and what role, might international partners such as Japan and China play?
Well, 10 years ago, when Vietnam first thought about building a high-speed railway, they would want to have financing from Japan. But for now, all the talks in Vietnam is that we just want to have domestic funding for this project. I think this might be realistic, but nevertheless, it's important to note that it still accounts for nearly 20% of Vietnamese GDP, so it's still a lot of money. So I think there would be some kind of financing that Vietnam would need from international partners, especially from Japan and China. And more importantly, because Vietnam doesn't really possess the technological capability to build such a very complex project. So I think they would need at least 1 or 2 international partners to work with to build this project. So there's a lot of discussion now in Vietnam on what kind of international partners, China, Japan, or South Korea, or France, that Vietnam could collaborate in order to build this project.
That's right. And just to make clear that we don't know who's going to win this bidding process as yet. But then, Dr. Zhang, do you think because if China wins this project, that there are concerns that both financially and technologically that will shift the balance of power in Vietnam-China relations?
Well, I think for Vietnam, there is a very pragmatic calculation that they could involve China in this project because obviously, if you look around Southeast Asia, in Laos, in Indonesia, the Chinese high-speed rail technology is cheaper and it's make it really fast to build. Also, flexible funding and easier to get disbursement from the Chinese investment. So for Vietnam, there is a lot of advantages that they can consider when considering the Chinese funding and technology. But of course, there is some aspect of domestic sensitivities as well, because in Vietnam, the anti-China sentiment is really high. So that could play into calculation for that. And secondly, the Vietnamese leadership has always been suspicious of Chinese motivation in Vietnam, especially over the South China Sea. So involving China could risk a long-term dependency on Chinese technology and funding, which Vietnam definitely doesn't want to have that. So there's a lot of complex calculation and dilemmas that the leadership in Hanoi has to consider if they want to really involve China. Despite the fact that over the past few years, there have been a lot of talks between top leadership in Hanoi and in Beijing on how Vietnam could involve China in building the high-speed railway from connecting Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City.
And China's Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, it's a huge player in Southeast Asia. And I'm wondering, how does that stack up against this North-South Express Rail project in Vietnam?
That's very important because if you look at the way that Beijing has started a charm offensive in Vietnam, we have seen many countries in Southeast Asia very open, very receptive to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. But Vietnam is among the most hesitant country to receive the BRI projects. So I think for this project, if China can win the bidding, it could be a very important politically for China because it showcases, the collaboration over confrontation between the two Cleveland states on over the South China Sea. And also, if China can win this project, they could show the world that even Vietnam accepts the high-speed railway technology from China, even though we have a lot of disputes and quarrels over the maritime claims. So I think this is very important for China politically. But for Vietnam, it could be a win-win situation if Vietnam can leverage Chinese support for that. But nevertheless, it could be a strategic risk because, like I said, it might be a long-term dependency on Chinese technology and investment, which could really put Vietnam at risk of being more dependent on China and which could ignite a very strong anti-China sentiment among the Vietnamese public, which again could be very risky for the one-party regime in Hanoi.
And Dr. Zhang, I mean, there is a sense that, China's Belt and Road Initiative is squeezing out other infrastructure players like Japan, for instance, in the developing world. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I think definitely that's a very fair assessment because if you look at the way that Chinese Belt and Road Initiative operate in Southeast Asia and even in Vietnam, all of those projects really offers affordability and quick implementation with even dodgy, financial arrangement, but easier for them to really operate in a very complex and very diverse environments in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam. Japan focuses mostly on quality infrastructure, but it's quite struggling to work in such a very complex environment in Southeast Asia. So I think a very important way forward for Japan is to try to also offer more affordability to countries like Vietnam to be involved in such a big project like the high-speed railway technology. And for China, this kind of infrastructure, big ticket infrastructure project is not only about economic opportunity, but also about exerting political influence as well. So if you look at all of those projects across Southeast Asia, I think it's more than infrastructure. They are tools for economic and political influence, and that's a very important tool for China to exert their influence in Vietnam or elsewhere in Southeast Asia.
Well, that's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot from you. Thanks so very much, Nguyen Khat Giang, a visiting fellow from the Vietnam Studies program at IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Now, East Asian countries are seeing strong growth in air travel demand. This year, passenger volumes across many airports in the region are set to meet or even exceed those of pre-pandemic levels. Now, with a strong post-COVID rebound in travel, the region's airports are among the busiest in the world. Last year, Tokyo Haneda International Airport in Japan ranked top in terms of passenger numbers, followed by China's Guangzhou Baiyun International Airport. Incheon International Airport came in third with more than 56 million passengers. Now, to accommodate a rising demand, airports are upgrading their infrastructure to increase their passenger handling capacities. Hong Kong International Airport, for example, commissioned its 3-runway system last week. The runways now operate simultaneously. Now, the airport is also aiming to serve 120 million passengers annually, up from around 40 million last year. Similarly, Incheon International Airport has wrapped up a 7-year expansion project. Now it's the world's third largest airport in terms of international passenger handling capacity. And CNA senior Korea correspondent Lim Yun-suk has more.
Martial arts performances are among the new attractions at South Korea's Incheon International Airport Terminal 2, which has completed its latest phase of construction. It showcases Korea's rich culture through art pieces depicting the Joseon dynasty, which lasted from the 14th to the 19th centuries.
공항에서 다양한 감정들이 이루어지는 공간인 것 같아요. 뭐 누구를 만나러 간다든지 또 사업을 한다든지 유학을 떠난다든지 뭐 다양한 어떤 감정들이 교차할 수밖에 없는데 이 사람들이 파이팅할 수 있고 힘을 얻을 수 있게끔 제가 그런 메시지에서 우리나라에서 갖고 있었던 좋은 의미의 어떤 형상들을 이렇게 기록하고 이렇게 붙이게 되었습니다.
The most obvious change after the $3.4 billion expansion project is the terminal size. It's now 734,000 square meters, nearly double its previous size. South Korea is hoping to make this a mega hub airport by 2026, and by 2031, it wants to accommodate more than 100 million passengers. That's a jump of about 38% from the current capacity of 77 million passengers. The number of flights it can handle each year is also expected to grow by 100,000 to 600,000. While cargo capacity will increase from 5 million tons to 6.3 million tons. The airport is already often ranked among the world's best. But Kim Hong-soo, executive director at Incheon International Airport Corporation, says it's a challenge to retain its spot, as many others, like Singapore's Changi Airport, are also expanding capacity and going through high-tech to enhance efficiency. For Incheon Airport, it's banking on its Smart Pass, which uses facial recognition.
저희가 보통 이제 출국장에서 아메니식으로 이제 통과하는 것만 있다 그러면 이번에는 이번에 좀 바로 보이시는 이제 보딩 게이트를 통해 가지고 보딩 게이트를 아메니식으로 통과함으로써 여객이 이런 뭐 여권과 탑승권을 제시하지 않고 바로 아메니식으로만 통과하고 보다 이제 빈틈없는 정확한 이제 신호낙인을 통한 또 보안과 이런 안전을 강화하는 또 그런 또 계기가 되었습니다.
South Korea says foreign tourist arrivals have nearly reached pre-COVID levels, with latest data showing it has welcomed 9.1 million tourists this year as of July. And is hoping this new expansion will accommodate many more in the years to come. Lim Yun-suk, CNA, Incheon, South Korea.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, an interview with Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles, who says that the country's defence policies won't fundamentally alter, even with a change in leadership from one of its closest allies. China has vowed to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity as Taiwanese President William Lai begins his second stop of a Pacific tour in Marshall Islands. In a speech to Parliament, Mr. Lai announced Taipei would provide a preferential loan for state-owned Air Marshall Islands to buy new aircraft. Taipei will also help build a slaughterhouse next year to improve food security there. The Marshall Islands is among a dozen nations that maintain diplomatic relations with Taipei after others shifted ties to China following promises of aid and investment. Before this, Mr. Lai spent 2 days in Hawaii, where he discussed China's military threats towards Taiwan during a call with former U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And he also met with U.S. government officials and members of Congress. In response, Beijing called on Washington to stop meddling with Taiwan and supporting what it calls independent separatist forces. China claims that the self-ruled island is its territory and regularly deploys fighter jets and warships around Taiwan to press its claims. Mr. Lai's trip comes before the return of Donald Trump to the White House in January, which has raised questions on whether the U.S. will maintain its position to defend Taiwan from possible Chinese aggression. Washington doesn't recognize Taipei diplomatically, but maintains close unofficial ties. Mr. Lai's next stops in the Pacific include Tuvalu, Palau, and another U.S. territory, Guam. Mr. Lai's Pacific tour has raised concerns about a new round of Chinese military drills around Taiwan. Reports citing Taiwan-based security sources said that chances of such drills starting this weekend were high to coincide with Mr. Lai's trip.
那么对于这些内容，我们会依据整体的研判来去做我们的适当应处的一个规划。但这里面有关细节的部分，因为它涉及到我们情搜的一个来源，同时也涉及到我们整体的作战安全。那么这个部分我们不会去做详细的说明。整体来说，国军是有能力、有决心，也有信心去确保台海的安全。
It added it's watching the movements of Chinese aircraft carrier Liaoning, which was involved in the previous Chinese military exercises in October. Beijing has held 2 rounds of drills around the island this year. And on Monday, a Russian naval fleet reportedly neared Taiwan's contiguous zone and conducted joint exercises with a Chinese destroyer. Meanwhile, China has deployed around 40 vessels in the region, including fleets in East and South China Seas. Now, Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles says that the country's defence policies won't fundamentally change, even with a change in leadership from one of its closest allies, the US.
Well, I don't think it fundamentally changes Australia's defence strategy. I mean, there's a couple of points to make. Firstly, as we conceive of our own strategic landscape and the strategic challenges and questions that we need to answer, they fundamentally remain the same, and that's about having a defence force which is able to provide for the collective security of the region in which we live, which is fundamentally the Indo-Pacific, but very much including Southeast Asia, but also ensuring that the rules-based order is applied in our region, given that that is fundamental to Australia's national interest. Ideas such as freedom of navigation. Now, in terms of the United States, we share values with the United States, we share alignment with the United States, we seek American leadership. I think all of that is very much in play with the future Trump administration, as it has been with the Biden administration, because we're talking about the fundamentals of the United States' strategic interests. And so we would absolutely imagine continuing working with the US in asserting the global rules-based order and on maintaining the collective peace of this region.
So, given the US is Australia's most consequential military ally, I'm wondering, what is your biggest concern regarding the AUKUS agreement, which we all know that Australia has already spent billions of dollars on it? Do you think that Donald Trump will maybe try and renegotiate the AUKUS treaty?
Well, we're pretty confident about AUKUS and how AUKUS will operate in the context of the Trump administration, and that's based on what those in the Trump administration have said, such as the National Security Advisor designate Waltz, who's been a supporter of AUKUS, as others have been, but also based on what people have done. At the end of last year, when legislation passed the United States Congress, which enabled AUKUS, both in terms of the sale of Virginia-class submarines to Australia, the establishment of a seamless defence industrial base between our two countries, that was all legislation that was supported across the political spectrum in the United States: Democrats, Republicans, Trump Republicans. And so if you look at both what people have said, but actually what they've done in terms of their voting record, there is a clear demonstration in favour of AUKUS. And again, that's what you would expect, because AUKUS is clearly in Australia's strategic interest, but it's in the strategic interests of both the United States and the United Kingdom as well. And so we have a fundamental confidence in the underlying rationale of AUKUS.
So I hear that confidence that you've just mentioned. And to segue from that, I want to just get your take on the current South China Sea situation. Do you believe that, rising tensions justify perhaps stronger security cooperation between Australia and its Indo-Pacific partners?
Well, we've certainly been working with countries within the region to promote the global rules-based order, and that's seen us work, increasingly closely with countries in the region. You can look at the Philippines, for example, with whom we've now done joint sales, which had not happened going back a few years. That's an example of the kind of work that we are doing with countries in Southeast Asia to assert the rules-based order. And where we come from in respect of all of this is a commonality of interest. The countries of ASEAN, the countries of Northeast Asia, all have an underlying interest in the rules-based order, which provides stability, which in turn is the foundation of the prosperity, the economic growth which this region has enjoyed over a very long period of time. So, we are nothing more or less than wanting to see that continue, and I think that's the sense that we get when we speak to the countries of this region as well.
I want to pick up on a news article from China Daily where it was reported that they're saying that ties between Australia and China are back on track, and your current government has taken great care in rebuilding relations with China. What are some of the key areas of cooperation you think that Australia is seeking to advance with China?
Well, China is a complex relationship. It's a relationship which matters greatly to Australia. China is our largest trading partner, and we're pleased about that. And so right there, that's the basis upon which we have consistently said that we want the most productive relationship that we can have with China. What we talk about working with China where we can, disagreeing with China where we must, and that does reflect that we have security anxieties with China as well, and there's no point in beating around the bush in relation to that. But I think what you have seen is very clear diplomacy with China, which seeks to be respectful, but which is very clear in terms of articulating Australia's national interest, making it clear that we do want to have a trading relationship with China, and in that we have seen most of the $20 billion worth of trade, which was in effect suspended, be brought back online. That's an enormously beneficial thing for China. It's obviously a very beneficial thing for Australia. There's thousands of jobs which are contained in that, and so we're pleased to have been able to steer that. But at the heart of it is having a very clear and respectful way in which we seek to communicate with China, and in the way clear and respectful diplomacy with China. And actually, we in the aftermath of our election back in May of 2022, the very first ministerial level meeting we had with China was the meeting that I had with my Chinese counterpart right here in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2022. And since then, we have sought to rebuild the relationship and to stabilise it, and I think people can see the evidence of that.
So aside from the trading relationship that you have with China, it was interesting that China's ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, he recently suggested that Australia should do more to improve military ties with the People's Liberation Army. I'm curious to know, what do you make of this proposal?
Well, in that very first meeting that I referred to back in early June of 2022, what we sought in a substantive sense, aside from wanting to begin a dialogue with China, was to resume the defence dialogue that we have long had with China. And that's not a means by which we resolve fundamental differences between our two countries, and there are fundamental differences between our two countries, but it is creating a dialogue which enables us to understand each other's behaviours, and that's just sensible, because what that means is that we can do our best to avoid miscalculation and risks, for example, when our two defence forces interact with each other, and they do interact with each other. Now, we have seen a resumption of the defence dialogue. It's not at the point that it used to be at. And that's not the same thing as engaging in exercises or the like with China, but it is about trying to establish a dialogue where we do understand what our behaviours are, and that is a sensible and professional step to take to make sure that there are guardrails in place, and both of our countries do understand our behaviours. That said, we have made it clear that the build-up, the Chinese military build-up, without a clear sense of strategic reassurance for the region is of concern to us. The global rules-based order we see as being placed under pressure, and we will continue to do everything within our power to assert that rules-based order within our region, because freedom of navigation, for example, underpins the seaborne trade, which is a large part of the equation of Australia's national prosperity, and particularly in this part of the world. So, we do have our issues with China, but it does make sense to talk, and that's been part of seeking to stabilise the relationship.
And I'm wondering if, the Taiwan issue is one of those contentious, issues, because the Taiwan Strait has become an increasingly contentious issue, as mentioned, with China's military activities and rhetoric raising concerns about the potential for conflict. So, Minister Marles, what's Australia's position on Taiwan and obviously plans to navigate this rather complex diplomatic landscape?
Well, the starting point there is that we do not want to see any unilateral change to the status quo across the Taiwan Straits. And from there, what we seek to do is to use our international voice in a way which reduces tensions and to join others within the international community in that sense. So that's how we will continue to proceed here. I mean, our fundamental point is we do not want to see any unilateral changes to the status quo which currently exists across the Taiwan Straits.
And it's time to wrap up East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cne.asia. Thanks for watching.